But he was a chap that used to the rough places and the roughnecks that were about in those days, all the old frontiersmen that used to go from place to place as a industry sprung up. The cane sprang up, they were there. When the tobacco sprang up, they were there. They always sort of shifting about. Big lumps of men and so on, and if a fight broke out, the police would sidestep it because these blokes were too tough for them.
Selby was the big fella.
And Selby.
Yes. Selby, yes. Huge.
It might have been. He was only a constable in those days. Anyhow, a fight broke out in the pub, and there was a bloke named Pat Clancy, and he did about 9 fights those days. This was about his 10th. And this Sergeant Tobin and I think it was Selby, he was a constable then, they walked down the street and Selby said, "There's a brawl in, let us get in and do them over." And Tobin said to him, "Look, have a little bit of sense, boy." He said, "If you get in there, they'll massacre you. Just come back to the station and wait till things cool down. We'll come down around about 9 or 10 o'clock and we'll find out who it was and we'll take them then." And this is exactly what they did. Tobin got Selby. If he went in there, there was no chance of him whatever of coming out of it. They'd have done him over all right.
But those fights too.
In fact, in those days there was 6 or 7 chaps come up. They'd heard about the good money to be made in cane, and £2 a day was marvellous money in those days. I think the basic wage was about £3.80 in a week, and if you got £2 a day, around about £12 a week, you were among the
aristocrats. And this is what you were getting. This was what the cane cutters were getting.
Well, £3.18 was the award rate. If you didn't get the award rate, I think you had to get something. I think there's something in the award that would give you. That's right. If you couldn't make the award rate, they have to pay you the award rate.
And you, as you were contracting a cane gang contract, do they? And you would expect to earn £2 a day as a good cane cutter.
Yeah, we were earning it. And there's a gang came up from Sydney, and I tell you, there were top-class wrestlers that couldn't get a living out of wrestling in the stadium. And Bill Hennebury, he was one of the heavyweight. It was Fred Hennebury. Remember Fred Hennebury, the middleweight champion?
Yeah.
Well, Bill was Fred's brother, and I think he'd been doing a bit of fighting those days. But later on, when he went back, he went. Anyhow, 6 of them came up, and I don't think any of them would have been under 14 or 15 stone. And they started off in a gang. And they had to carry rails and so on. Their hands were soft. They had no chance of carrying rails. At the end of their fortnight's pay, when they'd paid the cook, their tucker, and they reckon they'd worked themselves into the ground, they got 9pence. They found that they only lasted 1 week, not one pay. In the fortnight. After they'd paid all their way, they got 9pence.
Now, what would you expect to get at the end of a fortnight of being in a good gang?
Well, in a good gang, we'd expect to get £2 a day.
And would you work 6 days or 5 days a week?
5.5 we'd finish.
I see, so you'd get about £11 a week, and then you'd pay the cook out of that, or would that be after?
No, the cook would be in it too. But that was a top-class gang.
Yeah, well, that's what this Frank Bernard told me, and I could hardly believe it, because I know that the agricultural award was under £4, was £3 odd.
Yeah, £3.80
money in those days.
£3.80.
Yeah, so really you were
in the top gang. You were 11 or 12 quid a week.
Well, in that case. But you wouldn't have just come into the industry. When did you go into cane cutting?
Oh no, I was in the industry before I came north. I was cutting cane in Childers in 1924.
Yeah, well, see, new guys couldn't get into the cane. It was too hard for them, or it was all tied up.
If they did what I told you, Hennebury's gang did. They ended up with about 9pence or a shilling or just
I see.
Nothing.
Because a lot of unemployed have
come back. Then the new gangs got in. This is how Hennebury's gang got in. Someone never came back, and they got in, but they only lasted 1 pay a fortnight. Used to be paid fortnight.
And you'd be pretty sure. I mean, after before the strike, you'd be sure you'd just go down to wherever they pick up the labour and you'd sort of start. I mean, you knew you were going to have a job.
That's right. That was in the cane. But after that, you had nothing. In fact, sometimes if we'd done a bit of gambling during the year and ended up with nothing, which happened in a lot of cases, you put your time in the barracks, fishing and all this.
They'd let you stop in the barracks, would they?
Yeah, with some farmers.
Oh, farm, not the company barracks, in the farm barracks.
This would be the individual farm barracks. I remember putting in, I think it was in 1927 after the strike, that 3 or 4 of us did put our time in the barracks, and we'd go out fishing. They used to put half a plug of I could tell you a story about this fishing. We used to borrow a boat belonging to the farmer, and we'd go out into the bracken on the side, and we'd have half a plug of gelignite with a little bit of fuse in it, and they used to throw this among the bracken and then dive in and get the fish. Anyhow, this particular time, there's a chap named Roberts. I was rowing, Joe was in the bow, and the chap, Scottish bloke, Scotty Fullerton, was in the other end of the boat. And Joe said, "I'm going to throw the plug in." So he lit it, and he put it over his shoulder to throw it, and it fell in the boat. There was only about this much plug in it. So Scotty he couldn't swim. Well, he said he couldn't. Joe, I dived over, Scotty followed me, And I'm a pretty good swimmer, but I looked at Scotty, he's alongside of me, I tell you, what's he going? And Joe, we expected Joe to dive in too, but Joe put his hand back, picked up the plug and threw it in the water, and Joe remained in the boat. Well, when the plug goes off in the water, it's just like a punch from a solid. I guarantee we were about 20 yards away when it went off, and it was just like, whoo! We didn't hit like this, but we were too far away for us to do us any harm. But anyhow, we came back again, we got the fish, and we went home. Used to run into debt, they used to call it a dead horse. We'd run in and owe about 150 quid at the end of the year, you know, what was borrowing money from the storekeeper, we used to call that a dead horse. And we'd pay that off before we started to save any money. This is how they'd go.
So you might start off the season with a debt?
Yeah, start off the season with what we had a dead horse. Yeah, most of us had a dead horse.
I see, and when you took tobacco farm...
We knew we had no chance of getting credit at the store unless we were known that we were going to get a cut. And they wouldn't give you credit.
So when...
have some security.
This would be the way that they sort of, the North sort of, it worked. There'd be a good 6 months when everyone paid their bills,
right.
And 6 months when you ran up the bills.
That's right.
I get you.
5 months on and 5 months off.
Everybody, didn't they? More than the banks in those days.
Yeah, the banks wouldn't care. The most you could get from a bank would be a private bank. The most you'd get is 70 quid, and you have to have a farm and have the crop on the way before you could get it.
You know, I see. What did you do? What was the 27 strike about? Do you remember? What was that? Was that about wheels?
That was the one with wheels.
And then 35. No, 35 was about wheels.
35 was wheels, you see. So when we were
Oh, I think it was for green.
27 was the one on the wall.
27 was for green price burnt.
There was one on the wall.
Right?
The wharf strike. What about the wharf
Yes, but
strike?
the-
When all the farmers went down and loaded the...
Well, you were...
No, but I'm talking about the cutter.
There was a 27 cane strike.
This is one when they were turning over. They were turning over.
Yeah,
That's right. They were in the main street. The trucks used to go through the main street of Innisfail. And as they fetched them through, the cutters would attack the trucks and turn them over.
What was this for? What were the trucks going? Tell me about it. Start at the beginning.
And that was over what the cane cutters went out on strike for was for green price burnt. You got a certain price for green. I think it was about 7 and threepence. And if you burnt it, there was 20% taken off. That would work out around about 6 and 9 or something like that. And you could work it out. Mm-hmm. And what they went out on strike was, they said, well, when we burn the cane, it's just as hard. In fact, it was a lot harder because you cut it a bit, you cut more cane, but you were black all day and you worked long hours, and the cane was harder to cut because it got a harder crust on through being burnt. So they went out on strike for get the green price for the burnt cane.
Now, was that the strike that the farmers tried to break, or was that the wharf strike?
Now, the farmers tried to break the wharf strike.
Yeah, well, tell us about the farmers. When was the wharf, for 28?
When was the wharf strike on?
Well, tell us about the farmers, because I haven't got anything about that either.
No, I think that what happened, I don't know whether...
You weren't there, were you?
Yes, I was in the north. I was in the north at the time, but what happened was when the wharfies went on strike, they couldn't get the sugar away. And as far as the farmers were concerned, they were getting no income either. And they said, and I think I can see it happening now, they said, well, if you're not going to load it, we will. And the cutter said, no, the wharfie said, if you do, we'll come in with our gangs and we'll stop you. And this is when the brawling broke out. But they had police protection and the farmers broke the strike.
And tell us what, and they drove, you were just saying they drove down the main streets of...
No, this was in the cane cutter strike, this one. They drove it happened to be the engine drivers were pulling the cane trucks, and the tram lines ran through the street.
Yeah.
And they stand in front of the train, and they'd pull up. They were only working men on the trains anyway. They'd pull up and they say, you're not going any further. And they say, yes, we are. This would be the scabs as they went back to work. They say, yes, we are. Well, if you are, you won't get through. And they said, righto. They'd started off. And by that time, they'd hung out to the blokes behind, and they were tipping the trucks over off the tracks onto the road.
And what were the police doing?
Well, then they'd call for the police, and the police would come in and break it up. And they'd have to load they'd send men out, then the farmers that were working the mills, they sent them back to load the trucks up, and away they'd go. And this was going on constantly.
Yeah.
But I think that strike was broke too. It was broke by the farmers.
And yours was one of the first Australian gangs to come to Tully, and Wendy, wasn't it?
Yeah, that's right.
What do you mean, Australian gang?
Well, in those days, Gundi, which was a CSIR mill, the Tully mill was a government-owned mill, and it was mostly Australians that were working in Tully. And there was very few of the foreign gangs in Tully, but in Innisfail, it was about 75 to 80% foreign gangs. In those days, Italian, Yugoslav and so on, mostly Italian gangs. And they were supposed to have a reputation of being more docile, I think. And so anyhow, after negotiation and discussion, they decided to let 25% more Australian gangs come into Gundi, into Innisfail. And that was the year 1935 that we came in, of course. So whenever the Australians come in, they wanted better prices. And they wanted to live what they considered was a living wage. They reckon they weren't getting a living wage and they weren't going to live like so-and-so. And they wanted a living wage, and this has started the strike.
And were you in the 27 strike too?
Yes, no, the 27 strike, I was in Tully. The 27 strike happened
only in Tully?
In South Johnson.
Yeah, yeah.
I was in, what we did was put in money to support the strikers in South Johnson.
I see.
That happened in Innisfail.
It wasn't a broad strike.
No,
like
what
that.
happened was
No.
they decided, in discussing it and talking it over, that those that were out on strike would be supported by those that were in strike, that were in work.
Okay.
And that allowed these fellows to hang out a lot longer, people that had no money. Well, they're not going to starve. This is the thing that puts them back to work again, or a state of emergency. That could do it.
I see. Listen, what about anti-Italian feeling? Was there ever...
Oh, well, it always, in those days it was, because they reckoned that every strike that was on, the cutters in those days, they held that every strike that was on was broke by immigrant labour.
Was it?
But a lot of those men after it became real militant themselves, especially the Yugoslav part of it. They were very militant, always have been, I think. I don't know about the militant men, the Yugoslavs out here now, but in those days...
And the Irish.
They did.
Were the Irish...
Irish were
very good.
The Irish were militant.
Oh, they were always policemen or trade union leaders, the Irish.
Very good.
Were they?
Well, they were. When you got an Irishman that was militant, he was a militant.
Yeah,
That's what I
I
mean. Yeah.
I see.
No doubt about it.
And was it so that the Italians did break the strikes and that
No, they were
foreign
inclined to.
crop-
They were people that had came out and they were used to a low standard of living. And it doesn't matter what the standard of living here was, it was better than what they were used to. And they couldn't see any sense in putting themselves out of work when they were getting money than what they were used to. And that created the anti-foreign feeling, in a way.
But somebody told
I think
me...
that's died down a hell of a lot.
I think so too. But someone told me that there were actually anti-Italian riots somewhere in...
Oh, no, I think they're over in Western Australia.
Now, you've never heard of them here?
No.
No, I see. There were anti-Maltese riots at one stage when the Maltese were used to break the 27 strike, I believe. Anti-Maltese sort of...
Well, any foreigner at all, as far as the Australian cutter, whether he was right or whether he was wrong, I don't know, but he certainly blamed them for it.
Yes.
He was prepared to say they were the cause of it.
We were a bit narrow-minded, aren't we, about that sort of thing? We still...
For a farmer, being conservative is that he's isolated, he's on his own, he's got to make his own decisions, and if he gets into difficulties, the only bloke that's going to get him out is himself, and he's that used to doing it that he's got the idea in his head he can solve any problem anyway, so he decides to solve it on his own. And this is what makes him conservative. Why the hell are they going out on strike? Why don't they do... He's got all the answers. Why don't they do this? Why don't they do that? But what he doesn't realise is that it just won't work.
Yeah. Why don't they buy a farm like me?
Yes, like that. Everyone does. He forgets that if they did, there was, well, you can just imagine what the world would be like. But they're naturally, farming communities are naturally conservative.
Yeah.
After all, it was the Labor Party that started the tobacco industry.
Yeah.
It was the Labor Party that gave them orderly marketing. It was the Labor Party that gave them irrigation. And today you'll find the tobacco farmers here voting against the Labor Party.
It's strange, isn't it?
Well, they forgot, haven't they? Or it's different people have taken over the
That's
industry.
right, they've shifted around and they just don't know the history. And the funny thing about it, this last 36 cents rise that they've got came from the Federal Labor Party, because what happens is that the Council of Agriculture sits and it's formed of the agricultural ministers of every state. And it's chaired by the agricultural minister in the federal state. On this occasion, the federal government happened to be a Labor government, and Senator Reid was the chairman. That all that the Council of Agriculture can do is make recommendations to the federal government. Now, they did, there's no doubt about it, they recommended the 36 cents. But the federal government, if it was so anti-rural, could have said, look, you're doing well now, you don't get anything. But they actually Reid took back the 36 cents and recommended, and the federal government gave them the full 36 cents. So irrespective of what they say, it was the federal government that gave them the 36 cents.
Yeah.
Because they could have negated it. They could have said you can't get anything.
That's
They
right.
gave them now if they were as anti-rural as they say they are, well, they no need to give it to them. See? It's only they got a different method of working.
Yeah. Now listen, we're going right back to the 35 again. Did you employ labour at all much when in your early days?
Well, as I told you, that most of the men were out of work in those days, and we had a lot of comrades in the cane, and this 6 months in and 6 months out.
They came up here and
They
worked
came
with you.
here as long as they've got their tucker and a few bob to spend to go in and do a little bit of gambling and a little bit of billiard playing and chasing the girls and so on, a few beers and all this sort. As long as they got enough for that, they were happy to have a home. Otherwise, they had no home. And up till 1938, the war years, when they started to enlist and so on, and I think a lot of the enlisting was done from the point of view that, well, at least you're being looked after. And I think they had that outlook when the war broke out. And actually our laws, we had a lot more. Our biggest trouble today is labour. You just can't get labour. It's not the amount of... Do you know that they're paying here now, today, $150 a week for a labourer on the tobacco farms?
What, to chip and
No, for harvesting, maybe.
For harvesting.
Yeah, and you can't get men.
Yeah.
Their trouble is not the wages they pay. They're prepared to pay this $150. You just can't get men to come back into the country.
I see. But in those days, what you'd normally do, the help you'd have would be people from the cane and people like your mates, people you knew would come up in the off season and give a hand and live in your live with you, sort of camp in with you.
Lived in our barracks or in our boat sheds and so on, and they gave a hand in planting, harvesting, and all the rest.
And would you cook for
and then
these
when the
people?
season finished, the cane opened.
I see. And you'd cook for them when they were living here.
Cook for them.
The most you paid was around about $3 to $4 a week.
So 30 bob, 2 quid.
Yeah, 30 bob to 2.
Less, that's right.
And keep, yeah.
Yeah. And what would you mean? How many people would you be cooking for them this
5 and 6
time?
sometimes.
Oh, in the early days we'd only have 2 and 3, and then as we tried to put in more tobacco, well, sometimes we'd have 5.
Jim Ford over
5.
here, Jim Ford and the guard, you know Jim Ford. Jim had as many as 12 and 13. And they knew that much about tobacco that they'd start off about 6 in the morning and they'd still be there at 12 at night to fill the 12x12 barn. Today you can do it with 3 men. They're experienced today. They just didn't know anything about
with fairly primitive facilities, you'd have been cooking for them all.
Yes,
anywhere between 2 and
very
5 would be
primitive.
on an ordinary farm.
But that is still being done now on farms. They cook for them. They cook for the workers.
Yeah, I see.
And the women's side of it doesn't get any in the cost of production and arriving at the cost of production. They don't take into account, do they? That the wife is cooking for all the family.
It's changing a little in the fact that they get married couples to come onto the farms, and the married woman does the married woman does the plant. She helps with the stringing machine. See, we're mechanised now, and she gets the same money. My share farmer last year had a woman, her husband, and their 15-year-old son, and the 3 of them were getting $150 a week. She was out picking for a while, then she'd come home and cook.
Now the $150, of course, there's a lot more in that. They get their income tax paid too. They don't pay income tax out there. The farmer gives them their income tax too.
I say, well, now look, in the 30s, this is how you did it. Now, did you ever...
It's organised and...
There's a place called Theodore down there.
Yeah.
well, you could call it a farmers union. We formed what they call the North Queensland Tobacco Growers Organisation. And that organisation to us was exactly the same thing as a union to a worker.
Now, was it militant? Was it a militant organisation?
In those days it was militant. It was militant in those days because it's very hard to organise anyone when they've got nothing to lose. They had nothing to lose. They were prepared to put... when we decided to start our own manufacturing concern, they didn't only put 10% of their gross, they were prepared to put in half a ton or a ton of tobacco besides to manufacture and sell it. Anything at all was better than what they got to the stage where we got nothing to lose, and you talk about organising. This is what actually started the everything that we've got today. Our own selling floors and just get around among the farms. You remember Edgar Short? Edgar Short at that time was the Northern representative on the COD, and they paid his way down to Brisbane, and we had no money to send him down. But while he was there, that's the Committee of Direction of the Fruit Marketing, the COD in Brisbane. And we were growing then vegetables and fruit, and Shorty represented the Northern Division. While he was down there, he was organising the tobacco. He was there on their money, organising the tobacco. While he's away, we held the fort. And in those days, we had 2 cabinet ministers in the north. And the Minister for Agriculture, that was Harold Collins, and the Minister for Main Roads, which was Harold Bruce. Now, you couldn't get a better pressure group than 2 ministers hoping to get back into Parliament, and both up here in this area. So Edgar Short worked on them, and as far as I'm concerned, Edgar Short was the father of the tobacco industry. It was through Edgar.
Irrigation.
It was through Edgar that we got irrigation.
Now this was in the wartime then. This wouldn't have been in the 30s.
That's right. This was in the wartime.
Well, in the 30s, you wouldn't have had much pulling power, would you? I mean, you wouldn't.
No, we had 2 organisations. The North Queensland Tobacco Growers, which was had its headquarters in Mareeba.
Now, when did that start?
And that started in the early 30s straight away, and we had our own here in Dimbulah, which was the Dimbulah Growers Organisation. I was the chairman of the Dimbulah Growers Organisation at that stage.
And that was in the 30s too?
Yeah, in the 30s, and we worked our political line.
30s.
Yeah.
We worked our political line, that is negotiating to try and get a better spin from the government by 2 men from each organisation getting together and having a chairman. And we'd negotiate with the ministers or the politicians concerned for a better deal.
Because you had a Labor government for many years after the Forgan-Smith government. Right
up till 1940. In fact, we had a Labor government when the irrigation came in. We had a Labor government when the orderly marketing was given to us. And we had a Labor government when the tobacco industry started.
Did you have many knockbacks from the government, or did you sort of feel you
always... Well, in those days, I think they carried along in the way that things were going. We'd put our case to it, they'd listen to it, and if it was possible to do anything, would. And this is where the £3 a week came from.
This is where the subsidised wages...
Yeah, the different organisations came in, and we said, well, we're not getting enough money out of it to pay our wages, and they decided to subsidise it.
Now, when in the 30s, were any of the tobacco farmers on rations? Like going to, getting dole tickets and things. Some of the cotton farmers were.
I think there could have been, and I'm sure there was.
We weren't on a ration, because what happened with me, I think a lot of the tobacco farmers were on ration, but what happened to me, so whenever I found that I wasn't going to do well out of the tobacco, I went back to the cane. Yeah. And it would be 5 months in the cane and 7 months in the tobacco. Use the money that I earned in the cane to start off again in the tobacco until we finally got on our feet.
In 1935 we finished in the cane, and we never had any, but I think even then some farmers were still getting rations. Do you think so?
I think the idea behind all this subsidising, you're supposed to pay it back when you get on your feet, which is fair enough.
Did you ever pay it back?
No one ever did.
They never asked you for it.
Well, they reckon they were, but it was just, you can't get money from a stump, can you?
I know all the cotton farmers got rations in the Clyde Valley, so I presume
I've got to make some sort of a story out of this.
Yeah, I will. I know, this is how it comes out. This is how ordinary people remember.
You can pick your pieces out.
I will. But I see, so you never got rations, you used to rely on going back to the cane.
That's right.
And look, I reckon that it should, wouldn't, I'm surprised, really, with the cane farm, with the tobacco farm hanging around your neck, you were going to go on strike in 1935. I bet you thought carefully about it, or didn't you?
No, as far as we were concerned, it was the only thing to do. They were going downhill fast. The only thing to stop it was to try and be a little bit militant about it. And in those days I wouldn't say I was now, but in those days I was militant.
There was only Anne and I, we had no children.
At that stage,
5 years, we were married for 5 years before we had children.
And would this have...
There wasn't any pill either.
Many people have been in your position. Were many of the farmers up here working the sugar as well?
Yeah, there was quite a few, and those that couldn't make a do out of it and didn't have the cane together just drifted away, and the farms then were taken over for the debt by other people that came in, and then it was mainly the foreign-born immigrants that came into it. Today it's about 70, if you take share forms and all, it'd be 75 to 85%.
Italian, Albanian, Yugoslav,
be around about, it'd only be up here in Dimbulah, wouldn't be 5% Australian left.
Is that so? And there was no particular migrant influence when you went into it?
1946 the migrants.
Oh, they actually, after the war. The first migrants that were in it, were just as militant as the average Australian, because they were suffering the same way. They got into the tobacco and they were doing no good either.
The first migrant.
And that's why they were so easy to organise. They were easy to organise.
You can get Pickettish's migrant certificate, the first migrant #1 into Australia.
Yeah.
Very proud of this.
After the war.
The pits we used to make our end bed bricks. We used to put the end beds in the pit and then put water in them until we softened it so we could make our bricks from the mould.
Oh, you didn't make it out of cement like these ones?
No, we made it from the stuff that was in the bush. You'd have no money. You know that we put up barns for the equivalent of £50 in those days. Those same barns today, to put them up, would be $1,600.
That's a tobacco curing barn?
Yeah, tobacco curing barn. We built all around. They built them from timber. Slabs, they'd cut slabs go out into the bush, pine, and they'd get pine blocks and build them from pine, and then plug them with this ant bed, or you'd make ant bed bricks and built them from ant bed. Ours were ant bed mainly. And our first house was built of ant bed.
I see, and the whole top of it, and what's tin now? That's the ant bed right up.
No, the ant bed up to the walls, and then you put on your roof with
galvanised.
Yeah, well, you'd have had to have a fairly big capital expenditure. Oh, I see, before you could do much.
So when we first came, the first 3 or 4 years, or 5 years, a lot of them leaving then, all they did was just raid the vacant farms and take the iron from them that was left. Second-hand iron that'd go to build the cottages that we'd built later.
And when you said, I think earlier, that you cured your stuff at someone else's farm, like you use someone else's farm.
That's the first
that was the first
and did people charge each other for that?
No.
Well, they didn't care as far as they were concerned. If you gave them a hand, they'd allow you to use their barns and so on. In fact, this is how we did a lot of our own labouring, was took our men over them, they didn't care, like they'd give you a hand. The men up from the cane, they didn't care. Farmers would come over and work in with one another.
I see.
In fact, they've been thrown on, funny as it may seem, they're thrown back onto that today, but they're mechanised today.
They lend each other their machines and that sort of thing.
That's right, and they come over. So they've got enough, and 2 or 3 farmers work together, that's all you need when you're using machinery. This is our idea of getting out of the labour shortage.
I sometimes think it wasn't worth it. I've often thought that it wasn't worth it, the battle that one went through in the tobacco. It could be now, but I think if we'd have been in town, we'd have had some of our family around us. They've all gone, so Dad and I are just here on our own now. They were never farmers, never wanted to be farmers, the family.
I think that any lad that was fetched on a tobacco farm definitely wasn't going to be, things were that tough in those days, he had one ambition, to get off that tobacco farm.
Well, I get annoyed because it was all of you people, the pioneers, who did all this, and yet so much is forgotten that they give the credit to the Italians, to the migrants who came out, that they built the industries.
No, the industry was built by the early Australians in the early days, and then when they left, everything, the land was developed for them, the land was ploughed for them, some of the barns were up, and they just bought in for the debt that the
You were latter-day pioneers, weren't you? Because you were doing in the tobacco what our grandfathers had been doing in the war.
That's right,
because it was new industry.
Everywhere there's a new industry, you've got this type of man went into it.
I don't think the Europeans, meaning the Italians, and they were never pioneers.
No,
they came into or went into any industry when it was started.
Not that you actually, they wouldn't have started except for the Depression.
When they were good work. They would stand more than the average Australian when it got right down to tin tax and the money was cutting out. Once they got there, they took more shifting or more chasing than the average Australian did. You couldn't chase them off once they got on, but they had to put up with the same hardships that the average
Listen, one of
Australian
your, earlier in your, when you one of the things you were trying to do was get them more advances, more support from the agricultural bank.
Yes, that's what I say. Shorty was working on the politicians. Shorty was working on the politicians, and while he was away, of course, he'd been undermined, and I think that he was the top man in those days. Well, I think he was the brainiest man in negotiating, and we held the fort among the growers while he's away because they were elected to power. And while he's away and not being able to talk around himself, we used to get around the pubs and anywhere you could go at all and tell the story. So when election time came, we were getting the votes for Shorty. He was the top negotiator.
You were by no means, by no means unanimous, the growers.
Oh, no.
Well, it's a silly question, isn't it?
You ever get unanimity?
Shorty's, the Tinaroo Dam and the irrigation scheme was mapped out on Shorty's kitchen table, wasn't it? And at the opening, that was Labor government then, of course. At the opening, I stood on that parapet.
You never got an invitation?
No, he and Gladys were up in the parapet. So I went up to them too. I was invited downstairs. I went up and we stood there and we listened to all those spouting about what the present government had done, how they'd built this dam, how they'd organised it, how they'd done everything. And they finished it the last few years.
Now listen, I'll tell you something about that. I was on the irrigation committee. Shorty was the chairman. I was on the irrigation committee, and Sir John Kemp was the coordinator general. They fetched this committee up, and there was the coordinator general and the land commissioner and the head of the forestry department and the top main roads man from main roads engineer from Townsville. And in discussing it, we found out that the Liberal Country Party that was in power, in opposition at that time, they weren't only against it, they were absolutely, definitely sour on it. They reckoned it wasn't a good business proposition. Now, this is thinking, the Country Liberal Party in those days weren't only against it, they were
actively against it.
They were vicious about it. They reckoned that you're only just wasting money. In those days, I think I think in those days our returns, our revenue was around about 600,000 pounds it was in those days, and today it's around about 18 million, all through this irrigation scheme that they reckon wasn't a good business. It wasn't a good business proposition.
What time do you start?
And all that organising was done with the farmers that had nothing to lose. They said, we'll bid in anything, and it was a lot easier to organise in those days. I think the majority were on our side. Every time you went to a meeting and you put a case for amalgamation and all, I think I removed the amalgamation of Mariva Dimbulah. We decided that unity was strength. If you didn't stop together, you're only one side putting down one story, one organisation. The other organisation up here putting up another story, and no government could make up its mind anyway, because all the organisations had different views. You see it today among the farmers. This is what's wrong today.
I think you're getting more of the later days.
Well, in the 30s, you get 300 or 400.
In the 30s, you get 300 or 400.
How many tobacco growers would there be?
Well, most people think, in those days, what would there be, 500 or 600?
Oh.
And most people think through their pockets, and when their pockets were hit, they decided to attend the meeting to see if something could be done. And usually, you got as near to unanimity from this 300 that'd be there, than because the other fellows were keeping away. Usually that was unanimous, but never anything happened. Then the chaps that were against it would be out in full cry then.
Yeah, you're the next. Listen, what about social life in this time? What did
you found
do?
your own amusement, so your company would come, and in those days there was a little old ramshackle pub and a little old ramshackle theatre, and most times the...
Well, in Dimbulah.
In Dimbulah.
Picture theatre.
That's right, and the farmers had that little money that the weatherboards in the little theatre would be this far apart.
Well,
and instead of going in to pay their way, they'd be looking through the cracks. There'd only be 20 inside and about 200 outside.
Oh, God.
And the reviews companies always be a Scottish joke made, you know, and they'd be saying, well, they reckon we're Scotch. They're outside looking in.
Now look, tell me what else what you did.
The husband said I was
What did you
outside, but the only social life I had was taking the babies to the clinic.
But I think there were more friendships than that.